maybe still are, a British rock band. So I'm going to do a potted history of Pink Floyd. They're one of the most successful bands in history. Their appeal has been very big amongst the target demographic that's basically me. So if you're in a similar category, you might know quite a bit of this already. So Pink Floyd started in 1965, which was a few years before the official start of progressive rock, which was in 1969. So they had to hang around for a few years waiting for that. But luckily, they had their own shining crazy diamond called Syd Barrett, who fitted in really well with the psychedelic stuff that was going on at the time. And they quickly realised that a recording studio was a kind of playground, so they had a lot of fun with experimental effects and processing and tape loops. Dave Gilmour joined as a guitarist a little while later. Syd Barrett left. What left is not really as clear as that. He was kind of left out, and they left him behind. So whether Syd Barrett was actually crazy is something that's debated. He may have had mental health issues. He may have had drug issues. He certainly had some sort of issues. The remaining band members made a lot of mileage out of exploring mental health in some of their songs, particularly later on. And it's been widely assumed that this was about Syd. So Pink Floyd then got back to the serious business of reinventing themselves and waiting for the explosive success of Dark Side of the Moon. So they made several albums with music and experimental studio sounds, and they were generally fairly successful, having a particular relationship with film soundtracks and being somewhat progressive, but on their own terms, which I guess is the right thing to do when you talk about being progressive. They were not above having an organ now and then. They tended away from the mellotron in favour of guitar riffs and spacey synth chords. Fortunately, Dave Gilmour turned out to be a really good guitarist. So, 1973 and Dark Side of the Moon happened, and this was the start of the dominance of Roger Waters, who was their bassist. So this was now peak success time, with follow-up albums Wish You Were Here, Animals and The Wall. Somehow, where other prog rock acts faltered towards the end of the 70s and in the early 80s, Pink Floyd not only survived, but basically conquered the world at this point. Finally, with a sense of finality, they brought out an album called The Final Cut, which Roger Waters thought was the last ever Pink Floyd album, so he left. But it turned out he was wrong. So Dave Gilmour took the reins. And over the next 10 years, they only had 2 studio albums, but they sold so very well worldwide. And their other albums were still selling, and they did a lot of live shows, and they were generally hugely successful in this period as well. So after all that success, I think they were a bit tired out, so they took a break. The modern era has seen the reconciliation of Pink Floyd with Roger Waters. There's been several events and a rather curious final album called The Endless River. So now finally they might have finished. So Dave Gilmour seems to think so. Rick Wright died, so that only leaves Nick Mason, who's the drummer, if he wanted to carry on as Pink Floyd, but I think it's unlikely. Pink Floyd were, especially in the early days, influenced, or there was some influence backwards and forwards. Certainly they were influenced by contemporary classical that was going on, and krautrock may have influenced Pink Floyd, or Pink Floyd may have influenced krautrock. Who really knows? It may be that they were both just going from the same source of the contemporary classical and the minimalists and people like Terry Riley. But they brought these ideas and the interesting developments in music here to a much wider audience. So at this point, assuming that they've finished, their total studio album count is 14. Hi, my name's Dan. So this was Pink Floyd's 5th album, and it came after Ummagumma, which was their 4th album. but which I reviewed only a couple of days ago. So this is quite interesting for me in terms of context. Excuse me. So I'm going to put this out there here, which is to say that this is not one of my favourite Pink Floyd albums. In fact, I might go as far as to say it's my least favourite Pink Floyd album. But it's still Pink Floyd and I'm a huge fan. It's also not one that I'm very familiar with. In fact, I went for many years not having a copy of this album. So in my late teens, I embraced Pink Floyd. A friend of mine introduced me to a lot of their stuff. I do have a memory of almost buying a copy of this in a record shop in New York over 40 years ago. So again, that would have been my late teens. But for some reason, I resisted at that point. Anyway, so let's talk about the album. So it's 1970. Music's transitioning. There's a lot of changes going on in music at this point in time. Also, Pink Floyd have been are going through transition at this point. When were they never going through transition, I think. They'd been doing fairly psychedelic stuff. They started out with light-hearted songs about gnomes and bicycles. They then started going into more grandiose suites and avant-garde soundscapes using studio technology. Ummagumma was a very... what's the word I'm looking for? Experimental, that's it, album. They'd just been apparently involved in the soundtrack to a film called Zabriskie Point just before this, and they were not very happy about it, so they went into Abbey Road to record this album. So side one is All One Suite, which is the Atom Heart Mother track, which apparently took a lot of making, and I can hear that when I listen to it. So, and apparently they tried to take it on the road, and that took a huge amount of effort. One of the problems they had was they were using a brand new 8-track tape at Abbey Road, and the studio wouldn't let them splice the tape. They were very precious about it. So they had to record the rhythm section for Atom Heart Mother all in one go, and then go back and make the different sections different by going and doing overdubs. So they recorded a backing track with the band, and then got some classically oriented people to get involved with an orchestra, which is actually mostly brass and a cello and a choir. So it's interesting as a track and as an experiment, but it lacks something, I think. It's... I try to review stuff in isolation, and kind of in some ways, if it wasn't for the fact that it was Pink Floyd, and I know so many of their other long tracks that are so much better than this, then I'd be going, yeah, this is quite good. But it lacks the dark intensity of some of their earlier stuff. It lacks the cohesion and satisfying structure of the later long things. I'm also wondering if it's the fact that there's an emphasis on the brass makes it feel too much like an English brass band that would play in on the cricket green in between innings, or at the village fete, and it makes it feel a little bit twee, very unexciting, I think. But also it feels a bit disconnected from itself, and I think this is the issue of having to do the backing track first and then add stuff to it. But the redeeming feature is in the middle of this, there's a Dave Gilmour guitar jam, which is really nice. So I really like that bit. Side two starts with 3 songs. So they're very much songs now. Each of them by one of the songwriters in the band. So there's a Roger Waters, who's the bassist, Rick Wright, who's the keyboard player, and Dave Gilmour, who's the guitarist. So the songs are in that order. They did a similar thing on Ummagumma where they let each member of the band have half a side, but that was much more experimental. These are basically... songs, and they hark back to their more kind of psychedelic hippie stuff. We've got a kind of gentle naivety, we've got wordplay and dreamy stuff. I think If is probably the best of these 3. And the final track is very distinctive. I don't think I've ever heard anything quite like it before or since. It's called Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. So it features a recording of one of their roadies talking about making an eating and clearing up after his breakfast. So it's got speech and it's got kind of sound effects. I don't know to what extent this has been put together as a fake thing or how real it is. And then this is cut into other sections. Cut into sections and interspersed with instrumental interludes, which are okay, but they're not as captivating as other Pink Floyd stuff, and they're not as good as the Atom Heart Mother stuff inside one. It feels very much like they had to do this in a rush, or their heart wasn't in it. It's gentle, but it's not musically compelling in the way a lot of Pink Floyd is, I would say. Having said that, I think the transitions between the musical bits and the sound effects spoken bits are handled pretty well. The breakfast sounds and speech are, to my mind, they're better than the musical aspects of this, so it's definitely odd. So, the album as a whole is unusual compared to other bands, but is not unusual for Pink Floyd. Apparently the band themselves are quite disparaging about this album, and in this case I'm inclined to agree. I think it's weak by their standards. It doesn't hang together as a coherent album experience. It lacks energy and conviction, and at times it's relatively uninspired, I would say. But relatively, it's still Pink Floyd, and measured against most of pop at the time, and in fact, most of pop and rock over the years, this is still a better choice than a lot of things that are out there. So, that's it from me for now.
Marmalade, I like marmalade. Yes, porridge is nice. Any cereal, I like all cereal. Yes, porridge is nice. Any cereal, I like all cereal. Yes, porridge is nice. Any cereal, I like